Welcome to Project Planning for Post-Harvest Efficiency, Profitability, and Food Safety. In this section, we're going to talk about buildings and infrastructure. So when we think about buildings used for post-harvest handling and storage, there are a few essentials or fundamentals we should talk about. There's a wide range of buildings or spaces that we've seen be effective for this type of use. Everything from essentially a patio to a pop-up tent that some people refer to as 4 sticks in the lid. You really just need a place that has sort of a dedicated use for this purpose. Something out of the sun is helpful, particularly on midsummer days. It's the shade provided by that can help prevent heating up of the produce and actually help start to cool things down. So what are the key features we should look for? Well, first and foremost, it's got to have sound construction. We don't want anything falling down on people or product. We want to make sure that it's protected from the weather. So again, the lid in a 4 sticks in a lid is really a roof. It could be anything from a shed roof to a fully constructed building. We want to think about excluding pests. Oftentimes this includes rodents, so mice, squirrels, chipmunks, rats. It can include birds too, and so thinking about ways of keeping birds, for example, from roosting on rafters. We also want to think about the siting of where of this building or this location, and think about it relative to other farm uses, such as any livestock use uphill, or how close it might be to the production fields, so that any water any wash water discharge is going in a direction away from those fields, for example. So thinking about where this work will be done relative to other activities on the farm can really make for a much more efficient and effective setup. In our area, people need to think about heating and ventilation, particularly for any season extension type production or even winter production. And increasingly people are thinking about cooling these spaces. Helps with some dehumidification, so control of humidity in the room. And certainly ventilation, just could be as simple as passive ventilation with large doors that open up. We do want to think about including some screens to keep bugs and pests out, but thinking about, when will you be using this space, and what sort of creature comforts for human creatures would make the most sense. We talked a little bit about siting of the building, but this really includes thinking about adjacent uses. So what else is happening nearby? And this could be a good way of thinking about efficiency and flow, like we talked about early on. In other words, how many steps are there from where you're harvesting to where you're washing and packing? How many steps are there from where you're washing and packing to the cooler, to market, etc.? It also can be a good opportunity to think about risks. So are there adjacent uses that might introduce unwanted risks or hazards into your post-harvest practices? It could be livestock housing. It could be a path that's used for vehicles that may be going elsewhere and bringing potential hazards close by the wash pack. So thinking about the overall view of the farm, maybe even zooming out on Google Maps and charting out what's happening where relative to where you're going to be doing this work. We talked a little bit about flow, also thinking about the grade of land nearby. So we tend to use a fair bit of water in the wash pack operation. Where's that water going to go when we're done with it? We've talked about the importance of drains and how that can make for a more comfortable work area, but thinking about where those drains actually end up and where that water ends up. We want to make sure it's not going into any bodies of water directly. We want to make sure it's not going towards any production areas. We also want to make sure it's not going near any areas of high traffic. So that water is something we want to really get away from the wash pack area and get away from produce and give it a chance to sink into the ground and come up in vegetative growth. That's not a harvested crop. How accessible is this space? Again, thinking about flow and efficiency, how does product get to this building? How does product leave this building? How do people get to the building? How do people move through the building or not, as the case may be? And then also a really key part of all this is thinking about how important in a fiscal sense is this building and your post-harvest operation to your overall business. It can be a make or break place for many farms. And so it's for many people, it's something they prioritize spending on. Another key part of all this is, what is your role in this? Are you a builder, or are you somebody who would rather farm and hire in the building? It's a key decision or consideration to make, and it may be a mix. It may be that you hire somebody in to do the bulk of the framing, but some of the finish work is something you can do, or someone on your crew can do. So can be certainly a place to save some money if you do it yourself, but oftentimes there's a fair bit of skill involved in these construction activities, and I think people are increasingly finding benefit to hiring it in.
I'll follow up on that, Chris, too. Just, a lot of growers starting out, really energetic, optimistic. I've seen this. You guys have, want to rough it. These are package-set essentials, but you can get started with much less. And yeah, sure, you can work outside, little heat, little rain, little sun. I can handle that. And I can pack in the cold. I've done that. 40 degrees, no problem. But what we see over and over again is that there is a payback over time. If you look over the day, sure, you can handle it for a day or a week, but weeks turned into the season and the year, and time is lost, stress is increased, and there really is a point at which it makes a lot of sense to invest, to build that structure for quality of life, but for profitability, for efficiency, and overall, if you want to farm and make it a long-term thing, you got to do it so it works and it's comfortable and it's not stressful.
We've been able to work with a number of different farms going through construction projects, renovation projects, everything from new construction to renovations of dairy barns. There's a wide variety of structures that can work for this purpose. There's a wide variety of sightings that can work for this purpose. It's been really exciting to be part of the thought process and decision making on these projects. And we've tried our best to capture these really in the grower's words, in each case, as case studies. And we have these as printable PDFs, but we also have them as videos. So you're able to hear from Jake and Taylor at Footprint Farm, or Lisa at Mighty Food Farm, or the others at Last Resort Farm or Route 5 Farm to really get a sense for what motivated them to do this project, what they prioritized, how they made the certain decisions they did, what they love about what they did, and what they would never do again. So we found that these case studies really help to bring individual farm decisions about post-harvest spaces into focus, and we're constantly trying to expand the range of projects that they cover. So as we add additional case studies of other farms and other projects, you can visit go.uvm.edu/phcs. The link is at the bottom of this slide. We'll add new case studies as they emerge. There are a lot of projects going on. Some of these are being captured in the Produce Safety Portal as really short, informal case study snippets. We also have a few that are older but also very informative that we'll have linked on that site as well. Okay, so once we have a nice sound structure that we're hoping to, say, use in the late fall or early spring or even through the winter, and we've made the decision to heat the space, or even in the case of a cooler, cool the space, we need to think about insulation. And because in post-harvest spaces and storage spaces, we're often dealing with either a lot of water, either bulk water on the floor or overspray from hosing crops down, or aiming for high humidity in storage. We want to think about insulation products that will put up with high moisture and high humidity environments. And so these tend to be foam boards. The blue board that we know as blue board is polystyrene, and there's a white or sort of yellow rigid board called polyisocyanurate. This is also, you can also get that product as a spray foam, and there's a product called rock wool, which is a mineral wool. That can also be used for filling in stud cavities in construction. What not to use would be, generally speaking, fiberglass insulation and cellulose insulation. They tend to not put up very well with moisture and humidity. It can be done. It takes very good attention to detail in terms of moisture barriers to prevent intrusion of water into the wall cavity where these other insulations are being used. We do have additional information at the short link listed here, cooler walls, about various insulation options, including a link to a CoolBot summary of insulation materials that they found to be useful.
The polyiso is definitely superior to the blue board in terms of its overall cost. When you look at it at 2-inch, a 2-inch board and compare them, it looks like the blue board might be about the same or lower, but it is not as insulative, and you're going to end up using more board for less insulation and more cost unless you go with the polyiso.
We've talked about, standard framing of walls, and you can find more information at the short link here, the cooler wall short link. One construction practice that is becoming increasingly popular for some of these post-harvest applications is structural insulated panels, or SIPs, SIPS. So these are prefabricated, almost insulation sandwiches that can be used for. It's noted here, using them for cooler siding, but you can use these for walls for anything. They're very commonly used in timber frame construction to fill in the spaces between the timber framing. They can be load bearing. They can be used for roof insulation. You can get them with smooth and cleanable surfaces attached in manufacturing. So that can make for you having to do one less step on site. There are also there's also a product called metal insulated panels, or MIPS, MIPS. We have a fair bit more information at the cooler wall short link listed here about that product, and those are oftentimes used for coolers because, again, of the high humidity and potential for condensation, and just usually high levels of water that end up on the floor and ultimately find their way into the wall. What we want to avoid is this. We definitely don't want to have bare wood exposed to high moisture or liquid water. Those things don't go together very well, and both from a hygiene or produce safety perspective, but also just from a durability perspective, we are putting a fair bit of time and money into these spaces and into these buildings, and so we should think about preserving them the best way we can. We know we have potential for liquid water, either from the washing area or from drainage, but also, again, from high humidity and coolers and potential for condensation. So thinking about how to avoid bare wood and coming into contact with liquid water can really help us out in the long run. Some ways to cover up bare wood that we may be using for framing or sheathing is a smooth and cleanable material. And Andy and I have worked to pull together a list of these materials. You can find a nice summary of them at Smooth and Clean, the short link here on this slide. It's everything from dairy board, which you may be familiar with from dairy parlor or milk rooms on dairy farms, to it's often what you see in the restrooms at convenience stores. It's everything from that to galvanized aluminum roofing. We've seen this be used as a wall covering very effectively, cover a lot of area quickly and at a relatively low cost. There are really nice corrugated plastic products, Truss Core, Extra Tech, and Utilite, You can see the cross sections here in the lower left of these products. These are, for anybody who's familiar with the rigid polycarbonate that's used on high tunnels or greenhouses, it's kind of the same type of product, but in an opaque form, and they have tongue and groove connections, so you can end up with a nice well-sealed seam where these panels come together. They also are self-supporting, so they don't require a backing board of any type. Like if you think about dairy board, it's a pretty flexible product and it needs a backer board, either sheetrock or plywood, whereas the corrugated products really just need strapping or furring strips, or can even be attached to studs if the spacing's right.
One thing I'd like to add is just that often that is something that you should take into consideration when you're looking at cost. So you may be paying a little bit more for a rigid product, but it's saving you the cost of that backer board. It's also saving you the cost and time and labor to install the backer board or to glue up the FRP. Truss core and these other corrugated products install a lot faster because they're rigid, and it takes a lot less detail work literally behind the scenes, and it goes up much like vinyl siding if you've installed that.
And trying to install dairy board with adhesive is a bear. It's not something that is analogous to any other real construction technique, whereas the rigid panels, whether it's galvanized aluminum roofing or the truss core extra tech Udalite products, it's something we're more familiar with in terms of, we fasten something to a wall that's somewhat self-supporting. I've seen dairy board installations that it's peeling off of the wall because it wasn't, the adhesive wasn't applied right, or it didn't have enough pressure to set, things like that. So it can be tricky. Yeah, I think you're right on, Andy. It's important to think about what the potential labor savings is in using some of these more expensive materials.
When you're short on time and resources and money, I think there's some push or draw to actually not cover surfaces, leaving them unfinished. And although you can get away with that potentially if it's not a direct food contact surface, think of it's really important to cover them with smooth and cleanable, both for protecting the investment that you're making in the construction and for quality control in general. An unfinished surface is harboring dust and moisture over time and bacteria, and it just is harder to clean, and eventually that thing is going to break down and you're going to lose your investment, plus not be able to really clean your whole area, which can contribute to spoilage of your product, and as well as food safety risk.
Brightness and employee morale inside the space too is going to increase when you have a nice finished, bright, cleanable surface versus an unfinished stud bay.
So we talked about excluding pests. This is another area where Andy and I have dug into best practices elsewhere. A lot of what we learned actually comes from the Park Service, interestingly enough, National Park Service, where they have cabins and whatnot, and trying to prevent hantavirus among their guests. So there are things that you can do early on in your project and in the construction phase that are passive, highly effective passive exclusion techniques. This image is showing the use of hardware cloth at the corners of construction, so where the walls meet each other, where the walls meet the floor, and where the walls meet the ceiling. And the point here is this hardware cloth helps seal up in some ways the gaps that just happen when you're doing construction. That seem minor and small, but to a rodent in search of its next meal are a veritable highway to food. So this is a technique, again, it's a passive, relatively low cost way of sealing up those cracks and crevices that critters find a way in through. Certainly starting with good tight construction and paying attention to measurements while cutting things to size, and then is helpful. But also this flashing or wire mesh can help at the corners. And the third thing is the use of cement curbs to bring the floor, the connection between the wall and the floor, up a bit. It's amazing how effective that can be at preventing intrusion at the ground level, where oftentimes where rodents have the most cover outside. So that's something we've seen be really useful. We do have a guide on this at the short link that's shown on the slide, /rats. So in a common wash pack area for produce, we're generally seeing lots of water, and so high volume flow of water, and oftentimes with lots of sediment, soil, even leaves and other vegetative matter in the water. And that all can cause some problems for what are typically called spot drains. So like the circular drain we showed in the last slide. They tend to get clogged more easily, and they're really intended for very specific sources of water. So another approach that's pretty common among growers that we've been working with is a trench drain. And so a trench drain is what you see here on this slide. It's a rectangular cross-section drain that runs almost a majority of the length of a particular area, and it's pitched to one end. And there are a couple different ways to do this. You can have it high in the center and pitched towards two ends, or pitched only to one side. The point here is it's made for gathering a high volume of water and letting the sediment settle out. So it's a relatively low velocity flow, which lets the sediment settle out. And it's made for allowing you to get in there and clean it, which is a really important aspect of drains. We want to make sure that wherever we have drains, we have a plan for cleaning them and maintaining them. And so trench drains give you really good access. You can use a square shovel, as shown here, to get in there and get the soil and other debris out, and really give it a good hosing down and cleaning. We were somewhat surprised to find that there really weren't good plans for these types of drains, and yet many people were finding them super helpful and convenient. And so we were able to draft up some plans for a trench drain. You can find it at that resource linked at the bottom here. It's go.uvm.edu/drains. That guide also talks about other types of drains. So trench drains aren't necessary for everything. If you're mainly, for example, washing greens, and your setup for that is a 3-bay sink, having that drain off the bottom of those sinks go to a spot drain is perfectly good approach. So this is just a particular type of drain that's helpful for high sediment loaded water. One thing to pay attention to as we think about having coolers in our post-harvest buildings is where the water goes from the cooler evaporators. So the evaporators where the air is made cold using refrigerant, and whether you have a split refrigeration system or a CoolBot, they all have an evaporator, and it's the coldest part in the room. And as a result of that, it drops moisture out of the air. And so where that moisture goes when it drops, in the case of a split refrigeration system, it goes into the evaporator pan, the drain pan. And they all have a little drain hole in them, and we want to make sure we know where that drain hole is going to be plumbed to. The refrigeration project isn't done until that drain gets run from inside the cooler to outside. And so the pictures here show how those drains are connected, and you can see them running outside. So any of that liquid water is going outside. It's not going to end up on product that might be stacked right below the evaporator, and it's not going to end up on the floor or in the wall. So we want to be intentional about that. There's also need to think about this for CoolBots, and I know Andy has a great picture of a CoolBot that is properly pitched, showing the water draining off the back outside corner of it. So when you're putting a CoolBot in, you want to make sure it's pitched down and away from the room slightly. And that's actually if you actually look at the instructions for installing an air conditioner, they note that, but we often overlook it. So that, in the case of a CoolBot, the evaporator drain is the bottom pan of the air conditioner, and so that slight pitch out and away, down, and away from inside of the cooler will help get that water flowing in the right direction.
A lot of those window air conditioner units actually are tilted, so when you put them in flush with the wall or the window, they naturally slope back or out a little bit. But yeah, you got to keep an eye on that and make sure that it is, because some are not set up that way.
So to wrap up and summarize, we talked about a lot of details in what a pack shed could include, and again, you can use a variety of buildings or spaces and do this effectively. Doesn't need to be fancy, doesn't need to be super costly. It's really about thinking what's going to work for you and your operation. We do want something to be, a sound construction, something that is stable and durable, that protects us from the weather, keeps pests out. We know that the siting is effective and efficient for how product, people, and water are going to flow through it, but also doesn't introduce any hazards around us from adjacent uses. And a key question is, what's the budget you have for this, and what degree of involvement you're going to have in the project. The other thing I want to point out is oftentimes we get questions about plans, specific plans for, sort of quote unquote, the ideal pack shed. And there really is no ideal pack shed. It's or if there is, it's very individual to the business and the people. I will say, though, we do have a collection of plans that are available at the short link listed here /barn plans. So these are very common agricultural construction or agricultural buildings. They're plans from the Midwest Plan Service and Canadian Plan Service that capture some of the very typical pole barns and whatnot that can serve as good permanent structures for this use.
Thanks for watching this session of Project Planning for Post-Harvest Efficiency, Profitability, and Food Safety. We hope you're getting a lot out of it and learning things that you can apply to your farm. If you did learn something and do implement something on your farm, let us know. Or if you have a suggestion or a comment of something you've done, we'd love to hear it. So go ahead and comment below or send us an email at producesafety@uvm.edu. Thanks for watching, and I hope you watch the next video.